To be cast away, stranded on a desert island, is a terrifying prospect. Although it is the stuff of fiction, whether that be Robinson Crusoe or the passengers and crew of the SS Minnow, there are real historical examples of it happening, and perhaps none was more dramatic than the story of Ada Blackjack, who was stranded for years in one of the world's most inhospitable environments. It is a story of survival that deserves to be remembered.
Wrangel Island is truly remote, lying some 87 miles or 140 kilometers north of Siberia. At some 2,900 square miles, it's roughly the size of Crete. Its climate is described as severe polar climate. It is perhaps mostly important today as a breeding ground for polar bears. The conservation organization polarbears.org says that the island has amongst the highest density of polar bear dens in the world. Historically, however, Wrangel Island was home to the most recent known population of woolly mammoths. A population might have survived there as late as 2000 BC. There is some evidence of its early use by Inuit peoples, but it never seems to have had a permanent population. The island is named after Baron Ferdinand von Wrangel, an officer in the Imperial Russian Navy who, in 1820, searched for an island supposedly sighted in 1764 that might have been the same island, even though the Baron apparently never found the island now named after him. Ironically, the island was named after the German-Russian Baron by an American whaling captain who might have been the first outsider to discover the island in August of 1867. Thereafter, there were brief visits made and competing claims of ownership by both the Americans and Tsarist Russia. In 1914, members of the Canadian Arctic expedition were marooned on the island for 9 months after their ship Karluk was crushed by pack ice. The ship's captain, Robert Bartlett, walked across pack ice to Siberia to summon rescue. Unwittingly, that stranding would lead to the ordeal of Ada Blackjack. Ada Blackjack, a member of the Umpat people, was born Ada Delatuk on May 10, 1898, in a remote settlement near the now-abandoned village of Solomon, Alaska. In her 2016 book, Marooned in the Arctic, author Peggy Caravantes writes that when Ada was 8 years old, her father died of food poisoning, and her mother sent her and her sister Rita to a Methodist mission school. There she learned to speak English and to read and write. But she was not taught traditional skills of her people, like hunting and trapping and living off the land. She did learn, however, to sew in what is called the Eskimo style, turning animal skins into clothing. At the age of 16, she married a hunter and dog sled driver named Jack Blackjack, who took her to the Seward Peninsula, presumably to take part in the trade of hunting and selling reindeer meat. The couple had 3 children, but a bad marriage. Blackjack abused her, and after the death of 2 of the children, abandoned her. The Springfield, Massachusetts Evening Legend wrote in 1924, Ada Blackjack was married in the white fashion, and deserted by her husband, also in the white fashion. Left destitute and alone with her 5-year-old son Bennett, who suffered from tuberculosis, the pair walked 40 miles by themselves to Nome, where, Caravantes writes, she eked out a living by cleaning houses and sewing clothes for miners. With Bennett's medical care beyond her means, she placed him in the Jesse Lee Home for Children, an orphanage run by the Methodist Church. She then sought to secure better-paying work so that she could take care of her son. Meanwhile, Vilhammer Stephenson, the head of the Canadian Arctic expedition, had devised a plan. He intended to send settlers to Wrangel Island to establish a permanent presence and claim the island for Britain. He first sought to claim the island for Canada, but he wrote, it seems that the Canadian government didn't consider Wrangel Island worth the bother of colonizing. The 4 volunteers were seeking Inuit to accompany them. Hearing that an Arctic expedition was seeking an Eskimo seamstress, the police chief in Nome, E.R. Jordan, suggested the expedition to Ada as a way of raising money. Ada was a skilled seamstress who spoke English, and Jordan felt she might be a valuable asset for the expedition. Certainly Ada and apparently Jordan, neither one had a clear idea of exactly what the expedition was. In fact, Stephenson was deliberately keeping that information secret. He didn't want Russia or the U.S. to get the same idea, so the expedition was being discussed as a business proposition or a scientific expedition. While Stephenson was planning the expedition, he wasn't going along. He wrote in his 1925 book Adventure on Wrangel Island that he remained behind, hoping to secure government or influential private backing. Oddly, of the 4 volunteers who were, only one was a British subject. 28-year-old Errol Knight was from Oregon. 28-year-old Frederick Maurer from Ohio. 19-year-old Milton Gale was from Texas. And only 20-year-old Alan Crawford was from Toronto. Canadians were by law British subjects, so Crawford was listed as the expedition leader to support the claim to the island. This was odd. Knight and Maurer had previous Arctic experience on expeditions with Stephenson, but Gala and Crawford had none. Still, Stephenson wrote, "Who could be more qualified for going north than the 4 young men who went?" Stephenson had another goal beyond merely claiming the territory, however. Caravantes writes that he hoped to prove his theory that the Arctic was not a harsh environment that must be fought, but a land that would support a comfortable life for those who adapted their behavior. He likened the purpose of the expedition to the new invention of powered flight, writing, "As impossible as flying and as worthless as the Arctic were solemn figures of speech at the beginning of our century. The first is now ridiculous. The second is beginning to be questioned even by the general public." Had she known the true nature of the expedition, Ada Blackjack might have been even more concerned. While she had only lived with her culture as a child, she had retained memories of the legends of Nanook the polar bear, leaving her with a fear of the giant bears. Travel author Imogene Lapierre wrote in 2024, "Blackjack didn't grow up dreaming of far-flung places. She was known to be shy and had a crippling fear of wild animals, polar bears in particular. Obviously, that might be a problem as she was being sent to colonize the island that the Siberian Chukchi people literally named Polar Bear Island." At first, several other Inuit people were contracted to go along. Stephenson explained, however, that women were the essential natives to bring. For, he wrote, "Almost any white man can soon become as good a hunter as the average Eskimo. Neither is their help essential in the building of camps. But their women were needed to sew clothes and keep them in repair. It is the testimony of many experts who have examined Eskimo sewing that is unequaled in the world. The manufacturers of boots for hunters that are sold as sportsmen's outfitting shops will make the seam almost any way and then waterproof it by rubbing in grease or some other preparation. The Eskimo woman alone sews a seam that is itself waterproof. A seamstress not used to white men's ways will become angry if she sees the purchaser greasing the seam of a boot that she has made, for she takes it as a charge of incompetence." And so, he explained, "For a residence on an island like Wrangel, it would be almost impossible to hire an Eskimo man unless he knew that there would be women as well to do the suitable sewing." Initially, he contracted some Inuit families to go along, and Ada Blackjack, he writes, had been expecting to go as a member of one of the families engaged. But he writes, when the time came to sail, there arrived at the boat landing only the Eskimo woman, Ada Blackjack. This was a problem. Ada was desperately needed for her sewing, but Stephenson explains, when she found that the others had broken their bargain, she also wanted to withdraw. He convinced her to come by promising that on the way the boat would call in at some Eskimo settlement between Nome and Wrangel to hire families in which she could then take place. Author Tessa Holes wrote in Atlas Obscura, "The Wrangel Island expedition promised a salary of $50 a month, an amount that was, to Blackjack, an unheard of sum. So Ada overcame her reticence and went along with the 4 men. Lapierre writes, in September 1921, she boarded the schooner Silver Wave with only the 4 men and the ship's tabby kitten, Victoria, for company. But the team failed, as they had promised, to secure any more help. Stephenson writes, at East Cape the misfortune was that no Eskimos could be engaged." Hulls opines, the expedition was at best an ill-conceived venture. At worst, it was a willfully negligent act of astonishing hubris. Stephenson sent his woefully inexperienced team north with only 6 months of supplies, and hollow assurances that the friendly Arctic would provide ample game to augment their stores until a ship picked them up the following year. Lapierre notes that the lack of preparation for the expedition concerned the locals. When the expedition departed from Nome, locals were shocked that they were only taking food to last 6 months. Stephenson expressed another concern. The party had planned to acquire an Inuit boat, called an umiak, used for hunting. He wrote that the error of judgment was that when the natives demanded about double the usual price for an umiak, the party decided that they ought to refuse to be robbed. Instead, the men purchased the dory from the Silver Wave, a boat not suited for hunting. "Had I known that there was no skin boat on Wrangel Island," he wrote, "I would have been worried more than I did over the safety of the party there during the next 2 years." It appears that many locals, concerned that the expedition was leaving too late in the season, didn't even expect the men to reach Wrangel Island. However, the trek there was without significant misfortune. In fact, Lapierre writes, the first year on Wrangel Island went surprisingly well, although the group ate most of its supplies during the winter. When spring came, seals and walrus were plentiful, and the men spent their days trapping while Ada ran the camp. Caravantes notes, however, that Ada struggled, with the men's diaries noting her suffering from homesickness and crying. While this might be considered normal, given that she was separated from her son and her friends and essentially there alone with the strange men, but Caravanti speculates that she may have been suffering from Arctic hysteria. She writes, first noted in 1892, Arctic hysteria has long been debated as to whether it is a real mental condition. It mostly affects Eskimo women and was believed to be caused by the dark, harsh winters in the far north. In earlier times, Eskimos believed that evil spirits possessed the women, and the men seem to have had no understanding or sympathy. When one day Ada refused to patch a pair of boots, Knight tied her to a flagpole until she agreed to mend them. But then a problem arose. Stephenson had secured a grant from the Canadian government to outfit the schooner Teddy Bear to bring the group supplies for the winter. However, Stephenson wrote, the season of 1922 proved to be particularly icy in the region north and northwest of Bering Straits. Captain Bernard made a faithful attempt, but on September 23, 1922, Captain Bernard returned to Nome and reported to me by wireless his failure to reach the island. The ship was unable to reach the island. The group would not get the supplies. Still, Stephenson was unconcerned. This did not cause me any great worry, for I knew that, barring accident or sickness, the men were safe. Oddly, Stephenson seemed to show no concern about the lack of resupply. Rather, he was grateful that the weather had been bad, so that the group on the island would know that the problem was weather and not that he had failed to keep up his end of the bargain. He seems to have continued to be convinced that the group would be able to provide for themselves by living off the land. He wrote a letter to Galley's father. They're just as safe on their island as Robinson Crusoe was on his. A little more so, as there were no cannibals in the vicinity. But, Holes writes, as the weather turned, the expedition faced the reality that their inadequate stores would have to last them another year. The journals began to mention symptoms that might, Caravanti suggests, have been indications that the men were suffering from scurvy. Caravantes writes, Christmas came, but the 5 people barely observed it. They had no potatoes, no coffee, and no tobacco. In January, Crawford and Knight attempted to go for help, taking the dogs in a sled. They planned to cross the ice to Siberia. The plan failed. Stopped by the ice and cold, the men suffered frostbite. They were unable even to make it off the island. The food situation was dire, and the men determined to make another attempt, this time taking Maurer, Galley, and Crawford. A letter written by Maurer said, the chief reason for our leaving is the shortage of food. There's no adequate food for us all, there being only 10 20-pound pokes of seal oil to last until next summer. The starvation was showing. Knight was simply too weak from scurvy to accompany them. He was left behind with Ada while the others went for help. Caravantes writes, how she felt about being left alone with a man who once scared her is not known. Knight, on the other hand, worried that it would look improper for him to be alone on the island with a woman, but concluded that he had no choice. The 3 men left to seek rescue on January 28, 1923, at 9 a.m. They were never seen again. On the island, Ada took care of the dying man, the Los Angeles Times wrote in 1924. During those months, while she was a doctor, nurse, companion, servant, and huntswoman in one, Ada was a woodsman too. She fagged 3 miles out and 3 miles back. The 2, actually 3 with the cat Victoria, consumed the seal oil when food could not be found. The Times continues. Ada saved the oil for food, on the days when the traps yielded nothing or she herself was too weak to make the rounds of those she had set. For a month she was too sick to go trapping. Knight was dying, but Ada Blackjack was also starving. Knight complained in his diary that he thought that Ada was deliberately starving him. Her response, the Times writes, was, I was starving myself. There were times when I thought I should never pull through. On April 2nd, her diary entry reads, if anything happened to me and my death is known, there's black strip for Bennett schoolbook bag for my only son. I wish if you please take everything to Bennett that is belong to me. The 2 survived on Ada's trapping, occasionally snaring birds or Arctic fox. Although she had no experience with firearms, she began teaching herself to shoot. Knight was dying of scurvy, losing his teeth, making it difficult for him to eat the raw meat that is their only source of vitamin C. He died the night of June 22nd. He had recorded his death using a typewriter that Galley had bought. She wrote, I don't know what time he died, though anyway I write the date, just to let Mr. Stephenson know what month he died and what day of the month. Caravantes writes, except for the expedition cat Vic, Ada was alone, at least 60 days walking distance from civilization, any direction. Ada managed to hunt successfully enough to live, convinced the 3 men of the expedition would eventually return. They did not, but help did come. Stephenson had challenged Arctic explorer Harold Noyes to get a steamboat to the island. Noyes wrote, it was 8 p.m. August 23rd when we saw something on the beach, At first, we were not sure whether the object moved or whether it was just a wraith figment of the fog. But as we drew near, we became sure that it was indeed a human figure. It moved slowly down the beach and held out its hands towards us in dumb supplication. That was Ada Blackjack. Ada Blackjack was hailed in the press as a female Robinson Crusoe. Moreover, she was commended for her devotion to the men in her care. The Kansas City Star wrote, "Today, with her health broken as a result of the harrowing experience in battling Arctic cold and loneliness, Ada Blackjack is an example of woman's fortitude and devotion. Her heroism has brought her a measure of recognition, but her great accomplishment was the unselfish way she attended to the needs of the party until death left her alone. Science can find no greater valor in its annals of investigation and sacrifice than that of Ada Blackjack." But then a scandal came. Harold Noyce charged that Ada had allowed Knight to starve, apparently based on some complaints in his diary and some pages that had been torn out. The soft-spoken Ada defended herself and convinced the public, and Noyce recanted the charges.
In case you're worried, yes, Victoria the tabby cat survived, although her ultimate fate is unrecorded. Stephenson tried again to colonize the island the following year with even more people, but by then the Bolshevik government in Russia had decided to claim the island and they were forcibly evicted. Today it's a protected nature reserve administered by the Russian Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. Ada Blackjack was never paid all that she was promised for the expedition and received none of the royalties of the book that Stephenson wrote, but she did get enough money that she could take her son Bennett to Seattle to get proper care. He died of a stroke in 1972 at the age of 58. Ada, her fame faded and dogged by Noyce's allegations, struggled with poverty her entire life. She died in a nursing home in Alaska in 1983 at the age of 85. What was the secret to her incredible survival? Well, she said in an interview in 1924, "I don't think I could have pulled through if it hadn't been for thoughts of my little boy. I had to live for him." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop and book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.